All right. So you had some questions, Manish, in advance that you had wanted to ask me. Fire away. What is your first question? How can I be helpful? Do I have to reintroduce myself? I feel at this point, Talent Spotify should know who I am.
It does. It does very well. No, that's okay. I had like, I mean, firstly, I just wanted to get a general sense of the your idea of the whole space, which is performance appraisals, reviews, feedback system, where sort of it has come to being at this point in time, and yeah, where do you see it sort of moving ahead, just on a surface level? Um, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have lots of thoughts. I mean, I think Microsoft stole a little bit of a march on folks by recognizing that they could do things with the digital exhaust, right? That they could do things with, rather than explicit sort of feedback, they could collect signals, from emails and chats and meetings and all the things that were happening that, that you could use to give feedback. And the nice thing about systems like that, like what is now known as Viva, right? They're relatively hard to game, right? I think a lot of early feedback systems, I know the things that I'm sort of supposed to do for my manager to think that I'm good. They're not actually business aligned, but they're sort of superficially good or superficially gameable given the way that the thing is, the gridded out. And so I can sort of game it. So continuous forms of feedback, while also much better for modifying people's behavior, I think are a lot more interesting because they allow for exhaust signals and a harder to sort of, cheat system, a more difficult system to cheat. That said, as you know, I advocate the use of behavioral statements, right? So people have very clear accountabilities, right? When target audience has limitations, wants to motivation, they will behavior as measured by data. My job is to make that true. One of my actually favorite analogies in feedback is, are you familiar with TDD, test-driven development? Is this a style of coding that you know? Okay, so TDD is, you're familiar with the idea of testing in software. Basically, can I figure out whether the software I've written actually produces the results it's supposed to produce? And so the normal way that people had been doing things was I code, and then I write some tests that test my code. Test-driven development got it the other way around. They said, first I write my tests because I know what I want to be true. 1 + 1 should equal 2. So when I put in 1 and I put in 1 and I put in the modifier that is plus, 2 should come out. I know that already. So I'm going to write a test that puts in 1 + and 1 and monitors for 2. And then I'm going to code until that becomes true, right? I'm essentially going to code until it turns green. So I set out the accountability up front, the thing I want to be true, and then I code until that thing becomes true. And I sort of think about that from a feedback perspective, right? If we sort of say, if when Monish is doing his job perfectly, X thing will be true, then we can sort of, at any given time, right? In any one-on-one, you could ask me today, you could ask me tomorrow, you could ask me in the middle of the night. It doesn't matter, right? We can sort of measure, okay, we know how far we want to be. We know where we want to be. Are we there yet, right? Or how close to there are we? And so I really like this idea. So rather than looking at your body of work and evaluating it, saying, here's what's supposed to be true, your work is definitionally good or bad, depending on how close to true this is, if that makes sense, right? So rather than a retrospective analysis, you're essentially sort of forward forecasting. Now, another analogy that I love here is cross stitch. So this is a crafting thing that people do, right? It's a sort of a form of needlepoint. Generally, in cross stitch, you have a piece of gridded cloth, right? And then a pattern. And so, it's sort of saying like, you go red, 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 red. And then, then I do a line of green or whatever it is to make a picture, usually. It's kind of a form of needlepoint. And to me, it is the perfect feedbackable activity. Why? Well, because at the very beginning, I know what it's supposed to look like. I have a pattern. So I know it's supposed to look like, when it's done, it's supposed to look like this. And it can tell me how many stitches there are. In this particular cross stitch pattern, you're going to have to stitch 1,500 times, right? Or 1,000 times. This is a 1,000 stitch cross stitch. Here's the picture of what it's supposed to look like. You got to do 1,000 stitches. Then at any given point, I can start to ask myself feedback-oriented questions. How many stitches have I done? And therefore, how many stitches do I have to do? So it's 1,000. I've done 100. I therefore have 900 more to go. That's perfect feedback right there. I know exactly how far I've gone. I also know some other things, like I know velocity. I've spent about an hour and I got 100 stitches. That implies I will need to spend about 9 more hours. Why do I like this so much? Because good accountability feedback, how close are you to the end and how are you going along the way, leads to good process feedback. So imagine you're a first-time cross-stitcher and you're sitting there with your very first thing, and I'm watching you do this. You can objectively say, there are 1,000 stitches, I've done 100, it took an hour, there's some reason to assume it will take about 9 hours. But I, as your manager, can say, hey, let me tell you a few ways you could save time. So if you did everything that was the same color, right, even if it wasn't in the same row, and then you transferred to a different color, you'd actually go faster. So now I get to give you feedback, not on how close to the end are you, that's objective, we know that already, right? Instead, I can just give you process recommendations. I'll give you a third version of this. This is good. I'll give you three random comments, right? So we had, I don't even remember where I started. Oh, exhaust sort of TDD versions, right? This idea of sort of cross stitch. And then, you know, the final and sort of third thing that I would give you is, I'll take a lesson here from couples counseling. So one of the things that we give people in emotional relationship communication is a pattern for changing other people's behavior. So let's pretend you and I are dating and you're kind of pissing me off, right? A lot of times people say, man, I really don't like what you're doing. It's pissing me off. Please stop doing that thing. The problem is often when we say stop doing that thing, it's a vague, stop being mean. I don't know what the fuck means. I don't know what that means. Help out more. What do you mean by help out more, right? It's not behavioral. So we give people a pattern. When you A, I feel B because C, and what I'd really like is D, right? So, man, when you don't rinse out your dishes, it makes me feel really frustrated because it feels like you expect me to do your dishes for you. And so what I'd really like is for you to wash your own dishes, right? So I had an explicit behavior. I gave you an explicit emotion that it made me feel and an explicit cognition that backed up that emotion, and then a specific alternative behavior that I'd like you to do. There's kind of a similar piece when we're doing performance evaluation, right? So there's performance evaluation, which is the objective piece. How are you doing? And then there's my advice, right? My coaching as a manager. And we have to differentiate those. But in the coaching part, I can use a similar format. Now, I'm not telling you how something you're doing is affecting me. So I have to change the language a little bit. But I can say something similar to, hey, when you do X thing, you are likely to get a result Y because Z. And you might consider doing B instead or D instead, right? Some alternative behavior. So now I'm giving you very formulaic advice, right? Here's what you're doing. Here's the likely result of that and the cause, right? Why that thing is likely to be true. And here's an alternative course of action that might not result in that. So, you know, let's say you're struggling at work to cause something. I, as your manager, can then give you what we often say is feedback, but is actually coaching, right? Hey, here's an observation about what might be happening and a piece of advice. Now you're free to take that or not take that, right? Because it's coaching, but it's not evaluation. Evaluation is how are you doing in a concrete, objective sense, right? That's what it means to evaluate something, right? It's not an evaluation, it's coaching. And we need to differentiate between those two things. So those are the three things I'll give you. I'll give you test-driven design, I'll give you cross-stitch, and I'll give you the difference between evaluation and coaching and the clear need to differentiate those two. Evaluation should be as objective as possible and continuous and clear. and coaching should be as opinion oriented and sort of management-ish as you can, emotive as you can.
Right. There's this very, I mean, when I came across this finding in a recent research report that I read about industry leaders, where they interviewed about like 700 to 800 senior leaders in organizations, and then they sort of very blatantly asked them, "What do you think about traditional performance appraisals methods, and what do you does it meet your expectation?" Right, and it was clear that they said that it does not meet our expectations at all. Right? Around like 85% of them said it does not. And the next question was, do you still employ that method? And they said yes. And as a behavioral scientist, I can see, although the industry has sort of come from evaluations to like continuous feedback, but still, I think the majority of the industries has a massive status quo bias. And they can't move away from traditional performance methods. So how can like organizations like, so there's two parts. Is this because of there's no better alternative? And if there is, then what is that? And then how can like these organizations strike a balance between objective evaluations and subjective assessments in their reviews?
So there's a couple of different, so to understand why we still do something that we think of as fundamentally broken, we have to understand why we're doing it. So one of these is legal, right? Which is to say, performance evaluations give me a legal way to, if I decide to fire somebody, do that, with lowered repercussions, right? That is absolutely one of the reasons that we still have performance evaluations, is because legal, right? That having been said, I actually don't think it's the dominant reason. I think the dominant reason is people perceive feedback, employees perceive feedback as important and validating, right? So people, if you look at similar research, right, one of the number one complaints of particularly junior employees is, I don't get feedback, right? I have no idea how to grow, which is an explicit goal of mine, because I don't get feedback. And so it's not really about performance evaluation. It's actually about coaching, right? I don't learn and grow if someone's not coaching me. And so this comes from the confusion that you talked about a second ago. There's a difference between, so as a company, I want evaluation, because evaluation is a CYA, a cover your ass for firing, right? And promoting and all sorts of other kinds of things, right? I want evaluation. What employees want is coaching. They want the things that allow them to grow. The evaluation is actually almost functionally meaningless for them, right? Because who cares, right? It's, it's sort of tangentially related to coaching, and it does help me be a better coach if there are performance evaluative metrics and I can understand accountabilities and things. And it allows me to know whether I'm doing my job right and can get promoted or get fired or whatever. It gives me some objective metric about those things, but it doesn't generally help me grow. A different way of saying this is, if I just gave you a scorecard with no coaching, it is highly unlikely to help you grow in any real way, right? You know who knows this? Fitbit, right? Fitbit gives you numbers out the wazoo. If Fitbit was actually pretty good at changing your behavior, we all would be skinny as hell by now, right? It's been around for 20 years. We've had lots of step counting going on. Ain't getting any skinnier, right? Why? Because that's actually very good at changing our behavior. Mere evaluation in the absence of coaching is not generally very good at changing our behavior. It's a component potentially, but if I only could do one, coaching or evaluation, I'll take coaching every time. I'll take coaching plus evaluation if I can get it, but I'll take coaching every time. And so I think companies do it evaluation for CYA, and then they do it as a retention mechanism because people perceive that they want coaching. The problem is, if you think you're going to get coaching and what you get is evaluation, bad things happen, right? That's where people walk away from review season feeling pretty angry because what they were expecting was coaching. What they got was evaluation. And, I too would be upset if I thought I was getting one thing and then got something completely different.
So the existing, I mean, getting a bit more narrower. So these performance review systems, there are a lot of them, right? There are like star-based rating, 360 feedback, and all those things, right? And I would say most of them have the element of subjective evaluations. Right?
Mm-hmm, for sure.
So it's not even just evaluation that they're getting, right? It is subjective. So that also skews the evaluation, the internal and external validity of the evaluation. So the problem is not even just evaluation, but the quality of evaluation, right? So my second part of the question was, what is then the balance between the evaluation and objective, or like objective evaluation and subjective assessment?
So let's go back a second and let's use my so now we have a 2x2. We have evaluation and coaching, and we have objective and subjective, right? So subjective coaching, right, is given by humans generally, right? I have some experience. I'm telling you from the benefit of my experience, it sounds like mentorship, right? If you do this, you'll probably get better. There is objective coaching, right? This is the transformation of data into recommendations generally without the interference of a human. So, hey man, we're playing baseball, playing cricket. I've analyzed your last 1,000 swings. You did better when you did X. So when you looked forward instead of back, you did better. You should try looking forward. No coach, pure analytics, right? It's evaluative. Hey, you did better when blank, right? So it has an evaluative component, but it's objective, right? We know that when you do A, you get B, right? Now we're on the evaluation side. There's subjective evaluation, right? How my boss thinks I'm doing. And then there's objective evaluation. I have some metric that I'm supposed to meet, some outcome I'm supposed to create, and I am or am not creating that outcome. If you accept my conceit from earlier, right, that people walk into feedback processes wanting coaching while the business wants evaluation, the business can make people feel like it's coaching by adding subjectivity, right? So when you add subjectivity, it feels like coaching. So we know, I wish I had a whiteboard. We know that when people get objective coaching, hey, of the 10,000 times that you did this, when you did X, you had a better result than Y. People often don't take those recommendations nearly as often as if a coach told them, right? We like to get our coaching from humans, right? Rather than algorithms. Businesses can exploit that, right? They exploit the fact that having a human subjective component makes it sound like coaching, right? What they care about is the evaluative metric, right? Because they want the thing that allows them to fire or promote you objectively. So some portion of that, I think, is the other piece. And so I think if you ask those same CEOs, hey, if you could totally objectify this process, if you took all the humans out of it, would you do it? Many of them would say yes. Many of them would say, yeah, absolutely. Right? Because that's what provides them the CYA that they desire. That is the point of the process for them. This is an untested theory. I know of no surveys that actually ask them this question, but you caught me at 8 o'clock at night and let's get wild. I would bet that's true.
I think it would be true because it's also very, it is clear that they want that. But as you said, the legal side also kind of like restricts them to have this very strict process. And then the whole coaching idea also involves more resources and stuff, which is out of their control. So I think they would want that. Most senior leaders who are, employee driven rather than just business driven would want that. So it's not hard to think that they wouldn't want that. But the status quo is not only because of the needs and wants of senior leaders, right? in the industry, is there like or give me any examples where you have come across these sort of, let's say, modern, performance appraisal systems, which do employ not just focus on evaluation, but development through coaching, maybe, right? Or if you want to take a more behavioral approach, to incorporate these nudges, interventions in maybe their day-to-day schedules, right? Reminders and stuff, and then integrate that with their daily tasks, responsibilities. Are there any alternatives?
I mean, there are certainly alternatives, which is different than where do I see it today. Where I see it today, this clear distinction between evaluation and coaching is in highly transactional environments. So I'll give you the example of like a BPO, business process outsourcing in like, the Philippines somewhere, right? So you have a call center. Almost all of their feedback will be evaluative, right? Time on call, speed to response, time on the phone, like time away from desk, like all these metrics that are essentially productivity metrics. And as long as you sort of reach the productivity metrics that I want you to reach, that's all I as a business kind of care about. In those jobs, most people don't take those jobs to grow. That's why they're high churn environments, right? They're environments that people often, go into for a while and then come out of, especially if they don't rise into management, because they don't typically appeal to a growth mindset. It's not like I want to become a better caller, right? Nor is that encouraged. And so in those environments where the employee side is not really clamoring for coaching, the company says, great, I'm just going to default to evaluation because nobody's making me provide coaching. And you see this really clear demarcation. So ironically, I was going to say bad things about BPOs, but, not the best. I think it would be tough to argue that that's the best working environment for most humans. Actually produce a system similar to what I would like to see, where evaluation and coaching are very different, right? And clearly differentiated and clearly, pushed away from each other. So what would be interesting to me is, as you talked about, like, are there alternatives? I think there are, take a big tech company like Microsoft. I think that Microsoft could learn something from that BPO format, right? That focus on the clear difference between evaluative, outcome driven sort of, periodic feedback and coaching, right? Because what's interesting is if we separate those two, it isn't clear that your manager has to be your coach, right? It isn't clear that the person doing the evaluation has to be the person that does the coaching, right? Right now, we often collapse those two, right? And this is one of the worst thing about workplaces, right? What is the number one complaint about workplaces? Management, right? A good manager will keep you in place. A bad manager will make people leave. Number one reason people say they leave is management, right? Beats out compensation. One of the reasons that we have so many bad managers is because it's hard to be good at both of those two things, right? It's hard to simultaneously be good at the evaluative portion of your job and the coaching portion of your job, right? And so generally speaking, you get a manager that's either good at one or good at the other. If they're good at the coaching part, people typically love them, but the business typically hates them, right? And they get fired or don't get promoted. If they're good at the business part, they do the evaluation well, but they can't coach, people typically leave, right? People on their team don't retain. And so if you freed people up from being both of those and you said, hey, our business orchestrators, right, our evaluative layer is different than our coaching layer, that's a potential model forward. And it is something that you kind of see in some holacratic, which I don't like holacracy generally speaking, but some holacratic organizations, right? Super flat organizations where people sort of come in and out of squads and pods. You do see a little more of that separation because there aren't necessarily clear managers, right? And so the program becomes the evaluative metric, and then other people are coaching you along the way, kind of all of the time in a continuous feedback format. It would be, again, great to learn from. The structure's wrong, right? Hierarchies have reasons to exist, and they're good for particular kinds of reasons. But there are things that you could learn from that I think are actually really useful.
It's interesting that you mentioned Microsoft, because I was also reading a Harvard article which also mentioned that it was Microsoft, along with a few organizations, who actually gave up the traditional, appraisal systems and moved on to continuous feedback. But then I also couldn't find that where they actually moved ahead. And like you've of course worked at Microsoft, worked with Microsoft, um, and Microsoft now, of course, also has integrated the AI into it, right? Into their technology and stuff. So I want to now bring it back to like not just Microsoft, but like technology as a tool that organizations have, which can maybe help. And if you can tell me, what do you think, like how it can leverage technology as, I mean, both, I mean, someone who doesn't have as big of a canon as Microsoft with technology, so like a small business, and somebody as big as Microsoft, how can they leverage it in performance reviews and feedback systems? And are there any, pitfalls as well to be that comes with AI or technology?
Well, so if we go back to our 2x2 matrix, right? We have subjective coaching, subjective evaluation, objective evaluation, right? The current systems that we've had for the past however many years we're pretty good at subjective coaching. We kind of know what that looks like. It looks like humans coaching humans, managing, right? Managing. And then we're pretty good at objective, right? Evaluation, right? We have a metric. The metric is a poor proxy, but it's a proxy of what performance means, and we can track it, right? This is all of the this is a BPO. This is a classic BPO, right? What Microsoft and others are doing, and what is potentially interesting, is these other two quadrants, right? So what you talked about is AI-based coaching, right? How can Microsoft scale coaching by saying, hey, I can evaluate all of these data signals to maybe give you some tips, right? That aren't generated by a human, they're generated by algorithm, but that are relatively objective sort of tips based on what I'm seeing in your data, right? That is one usage of AI. Now, there's two potential pitfalls there. One, you can get it wrong, right? Algorithms are wrong routinely. Whether they're more wrong than humans, hard to know, right? Whether they're certainly easier to fix than humans are, right? So when there's an error in an algorithm, we certainly generally know how to fix it more readily. But it can be tone deaf, right? In a way where a human would say, obviously, that's not true. There's not error correction in the right way. The other and potentially larger problem is people don't seem to be psychologically willing to take feedback from algorithms as readily. So there are experiments where you get an algorithm to generate feedback. This is a very Noom-like finding, right? Noom, the sort of weight loss company. You get an algorithm to generate feedback. People will ignore that generated feedback. But if you give it to them in a way that sounds like a human, right? They can see their face. The coach gives it to them. They're literally just reading off shit from the algorithm, but it's got a human layer on top of it. People are much more likely to take it. So one potential problem is being wrong, right? Technological problem. And the other is receptivity. It isn't clear that people are willing to take algorithmic advice. Now, what I will say is people are getting more willing to take algorithmic advice. So 50 years ago, if I said, here's an automated trading solution, no one would have said yes, right? Everyone would have said, I need a broker who's a human, who balances my portfolio and knows stuff. I don't want any of this machine shit, right? Now, robo-advisors are relatively well accepted. Index funds, right? So like, algorithmically generated portfolio-based things are accepted in at least some parts of our lives. And so there is this curve up where you could imagine this quadrant getting better. So then that goes to the other quadrant, which is subjective evaluation. Objective evaluation has typically focused on what we think of as hard skills, right? Because they're easier to measure, right? And so what that has caused is an over-rotation towards hard skills. I don't want to talk about soft skills because they're hard to evaluate people on in an objective way. They open me up to lawsuits and all sorts of other things and biases and whatever. And so I just don't open that box. That's another place where technology potentially has room to play, right? It's to say, how do I take all this subjective digital advice, digital exhaust, and give it the veneer of objectivity, or give it elements of objectivity, right? So if you think about what was happening down here in objective coaching, what's really happening is, hey, we have LLMs, so it sounds like a human now. It mimics this quadrant, even though it's actually this quadrant, right? Same thing happens over here. So we take subjective feedback, but we use analytical methods that make it sound more objective, right? They give it the veneer of objectivity, or at least some of the characteristics of objectivity. And so that's actually what technology can do. It can take the quadrants that we like, right? The business likes this one, humans, employees like this one. It can take the ones we don't like and make them relatively more closer to the ones that we like, right? And over time, technology theoretically can cause these to drift fully into this or closer to this piece. And one of the nice things about these, what we might call hybrid solutions, is typically there are benefits from this quadrant and this quadrant that I inherit when I move, that don't get lost as I move closer here. So I'll give you the following example. Let's take typically subjective assessment, right? You apply for a mortgage. Somebody looks at all your financial information, decides whether to give you that mortgage or not. Typically, they have some algorithm that advises them, but they are ultimately the one making the decision. This is, at least in the United States, very racist, right? So we know that Black Americans are much less likely to get mortgages than their white American counterparts, even given identical financial data, right? People, fucking racists. Algorithms are also racist, right? So this lower quadrant right here is also racist. It's just less racist than actual humans, right? So if actual humans are 10% racist, algorithms are 5% racist, right? So but people have the wrong evaluative point, right? When we evaluate a human, we evaluate them against human nature. People are flawed. It's okay to be 10% racist, right? I'd like it to be 5% racist. Let's move in that direction. But I recognize that everybody is flawed. With algorithms, the comparison point is 0, right? You should be perfectly right. That's what I expect from an algorithm. So any flaw, 5% is seen as very bad, whereas a 5% racist human is seen as very good, right? The other thing about algorithmic things, as we drift up here, is they are correctable. So unlike a human, if I want to like de-racist Manish, that's not easy to do, right? Turns out to be actually quite hard to do. Lots of decades of behavioral science have tried, turns out to be relatively hard. It is relatively easy to de-racicize an algorithm, right? I point out where it's being racist, I feed it new data, I change the characteristics of the model or the factors of the model, and I can actually make it less racist, right? So when I take things that are down here, which people currently don't like, and I move them this direction or give them the veneer of this direction, I still get the benefits of the thing I had down here, or at least some of the benefits of the thing I had down here. Same thing on this side, right? People like this objective notion. As I drift downward from the subjective, when I make this subjective quadrant appear more objective, or at least use some of the techniques of objectivity, I still get some of the benefits of subjectivity, which is that soft skills are really important and matter. And even though they're hard to measure, it's not like we should only measure the objective things. So I actually get those benefits as I drift down. And so these, you might think of as hybrid quadrants, right? This sort of halfway between the top and the bottom on either side of this, either coaching or evaluation. That's a really strong potential future for sort of the technology in this space.
Yeah, I did read about the hybrid way as well, and people transitioning from traditional to developing and then hybrid. Bringing sort of behavioral science into this, right now the things that you spoke about also, I mean, of course, I assume that people will, make objective comments about their peers, about their employees, right, based on the questions they are asked. So the way these reviews are done is they're usually sort of either form goes out to them and they fill out form, and it happens confidentially, and then it's sort of released to the employee, right? And then the coaching is sort of one-on-one if it does happen. But sort of when it does take place, when these managers or peers take these evaluations, this like whole buzzword about like unconscious bias, right, comes up. It's not really so unconscious, but some people brutally just biased. In terms of that, and this is where, I mean, the thing that we are doing at Talent Spotify is to try to mitigate it from the get-go, which is the bias shouldn't come up in the evaluation. So it's designing these evaluation surveys or the modes of evaluation can be de-biased using technology and behavioral science. Do you see like the scope there in sort of you know integrating these two things right at the beginning, and then how do you like scale it from there right up to the coaching bit together, like AI and behavioral science?
I mean, so first of all, I'll say if it was easy, I'd have done it already, right? I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. I do go back to the sort of hybrid nature of things, right? So if one of the benefits of objectivity is the debiasing of things, right? Even using techniques of objectivity on top of subjectivity is better. So I'll give you the following example. Getting people to try to take subjective things and make objective things out of them is almost certainly worse than just letting them be subjective and then us adding objectivity, right? So I'll use the following example. Let's say you and I are going to admit people to college. One way to do that is, Anil and Sana and all of us, we're all college counselors, and we sit around together and I sort of talk to you about a student, and then we sort of pool decision making, right? So that gets away from my individual bias to now at least there are other people, right? Indrajit can say, oh man, like, Matt, it feels like you're being a little biased here, right? Like we can error check each other, right? So one way traditionally people have done this is to say, well, let's take these individual judgments and pool them. So in the synthesis, we debias some of it because there's diversity within the system, right? Now, it's not that we're independent actors, right? You read my evaluation and you might change your mind because you like me, and so you move your evaluation towards me, and there's all sorts of things that happen here. What objectivity can add to that is say, hey, be as subjective as you want. Just give us your subjective impressions. And then we can use objective techniques to generate something out of this. So in reality, it's another good experiment. This was actually done on college evaluations. If I just watch you make a bunch of college evaluations, right, and then I make an algorithm out of that, that algorithm performs y'all. Right? It outperforms the group because it norms across the biases, right? And so it doesn't say, Manish likes Matt and pulls you over this way, right? It just says, yes, they had independent data points and I can collate those independent data points. So as we move to these hybrid things, I don't think debiasing human evaluation is the answer. I think we let humans in their evaluation, we let humans be humans, and then we use techniques on the back end to try and deal with their biases, right? Now, look, that doesn't mean we should abandon debiasing altogether, if that makes sense, right? I do think it's, obviously if I can get less bias inputs, then the algorithm has to do less work in debiasing. So I should make as good faith of an effort up front to debias people in their evaluations. Where I think people go wrong or where errors occur is when people try and believe that, well, I'm sufficiently good at that I can treat that, I use behavioral science tricks to make Manish be as objective as he can. I should now treat that as objective. No, you should treat that as more objective, right? So you want front end tricks that get people to be more objective than they would ordinarily be. And you still want to pool, and you still want to use algorithms, and you still want to use synthesis to then remove additional layers of noise, which bias is just noise. Does that make sense? So there's a data collection version of this and a synthesis version of this. And ideally you do both. I think the error is when people treat it as if you only need to do one, which is almost, again, certainly not true.
Yeah, apart from the let humans be humans, everything makes perfect sense. Cut.
Well, let me say that differently. Rather than saying let humans be humans, let me say acknowledge that humans are humans. So, meaning, even you and I could pull out every behavioral science trick in the book that we can find to try and make sure that people are as objective as humanly possible, and they will still be biased, right? Like, it's Sisyphusian. I can get you to be half as racist as you were before, you'll still be pretty racist, right? Just because, like, that's the nature of humans. Like, there are literal structures in our brain that do these things, and it's very hard to get people to act perfectly objectively. So I think you should just make that not the goal. It should not be the goal to try and make people perfectly objective. Instead, it should be try to make them as objective as you can while acknowledging that they'll never get all the way there. And then, given that acknowledgement, creating systems that do the additional step of debiasing, through algorithms and pooling, et cetera. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So it's not so much let humans be humans, but it's acknowledge that humans will always be imperfect. Always.
Okay.
Right? It is impossible to fully debias humans. And so whatever cleaning up of the inputs that we can do, we are still going to have to do an outcome-based cleanup.
Perfect. So we are, I think, nearing the end, and I kind of want to also give the people that are here, maybe if anybody has any questions for Matt, Anil, yeah.
Thanks, Matt, for your wonderful talk. Just want to know that one, like as you rightly said, humans are humans, so you can't avoid you can't avoid the biases. It could be may not be a conscious bias, but it could be an unconscious bias. However, the challenge is how do we know as a systems perspective what is conscious bias, what is unconscious bias? How do you segregate over there? By the system in the background when you are doing an algorithms, when you are preparing, that would be really a challenge. So how do you see that one as a segregation?
So I think the first temptation I have is why do we care? There's been this huge emphasis on unconscious versus conscious bias. And the reason that we typically just decide that we're going to care is because there are moral implications, right? Being, consciously biased is bad. Being unconsciously biased is less bad. And so I care about the relative degree of conscious or unconsciousness because I make moral evaluations of it. In terms of writing an algorithm to try and generate objective feedback, the algorithm doesn't care. It does not matter if you are being biased because you're an asshole, right? Or being biased, because you don't know any better, or you're not even realizing your own bias. It doesn't care. The same sort of error correction needs to happen. A good example is error correction, literal error correction in like noise. So Vowel and any other video conferencing platform is doing lots of error correction, right, to make up for the fact that we're not in the same room and that there's some limited fidelity and there's mics on both ends and speakers on both ends. So there's error correction happening all the time. It doesn't care if the noise is my dog, this crackling microphone, right? Somewhat, a leak in the pipe somewhere under the Atlantic. Like, it doesn't care, right? It just says, all right, I got to make this as lossless as possible. Here are all the ways that I can make this lossless. So I think there's this human tendency, and I totally get why as humans, we're like, yeah, right. I really would rather know, I want to know how much of this is objective and subjective, or conscious and unconscious. But in reality, if what we care about is reducing bias, it doesn't actually matter, or rather it matters only to the extent that it matters, right? That it allows us to reduce bias. If knowing doesn't allow us to reduce bias, knowing doesn't matter. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Which feels icky because we really, really, really feel like we want to know, right? You feel like, yeah, I want to know how, like, if my employees are being, subjectively biased, I want to know that because it's human curiosity to want to know. But from a change perspective, unless that results in you creating less bias on the outcome, it doesn't actually matter.
Thanks, Matt. One more question I have on this one.
Yeah, of course.
Like, in your conversation previously, you said like when employee is expecting a coaching, but manager is giving a feedback. Okay, that's where actually the disappointment is coming up. So in this context, like, do you think companies requires to run some workshops to coach managers how to do a coaching to the employees rather than giving a feedback? Do you think that is going to be a possible for the entire companies on this one as a culture change? It's a big culture shift.
I think it's certainly a big culture shift. It starts with a recognition that the two things are different, right? So I think the path is roughly this, and I'm going to pretend that Manish is my manager, okay, as he frequently manages me, right? So in the moment, he has no concept of those two as different. He's being required to do both, but he doesn't understand them to be different, okay? The step one is helping him recognize those two are different, right? That is table stakes for being able to improve, because then I can say, hey, you have good skills here or bad skills here. I'm going to give you training separately, right? Like I can start to address them as separate topics and separate skills. That is the first step. The second step to me would be disambiguating that between people, right? So if we recognize that they're different, now saying, and I'm going to have one person do one and another person do the other so that they don't cross-contaminate and because they are different skill sets. So from a change management perspective, I think first we have to recognize that they are different. The second thing we need to do is unbundle them so that I can optimize each. This is a standard tactic in anything, right? We got to unbundle to optimize, because when things are bundled, they're harder to optimize. So unbundling them to optimize. And then, the third piece of that, I think, is probably going to be tooling, right? So the moment I unbundle them, I allow people to develop specialization, and I can make increasingly specialized tools. So if they're bundled and in the same person, I have to make a tool that appeals to the lowest common denominator, right? Meaning I can't say anything sophisticated because the person on the other end, A, doesn't understand that the two are different and is a neophyte at both. The moment I unbundle them, I create samurai. So what do I mean by that? So you look at Chinese martial arts. China had giant populations. And so their strategy of going to war was, what are the cheapest weapons I can make, right? And get peasants to use, right? Because I have overwhelming numbers. And so if you look at Chinese martial arts, they've got flimsy swords, they're hitting people with sticks, right? That's what a staff or spear is, right? Like extraordinarily easy to produce cheap weaponry that any neophyte can use. You then have Japan, dwarfed in population, massively smaller population than their Chinese neighbors. So they take a different strategy. They say, we're going to make war machines. They're going to have amazing armor, and they're going to spend their whole lives learning how to be good warriors, right? This is a finest tuned thing. When we are essentially treating managers and evaluators, when we're treating coaches and evaluators as the same, you have China, right? You got a huge number of people. And so any tooling that you build has to be usable by the average Joe, by the average manager. The moment you start specialization, you can upgrade your tools, right? Suddenly I've got armor and really expensive samurai swords that don't break and aren't flimsy and are very sharp and hold their edge for a long period of time and are very valuable, because it starts to make sense to do specialization, and to upskill people within a particular discipline. Does that make sense? So to me, it's that 3-step process. Disambiguation, these two things are different, right? Specialization, and they can be done by different people. And then mechanization, and we can give them different tools accustomed to that specialization. So that's that 3-step process, I think, is sort of how this change management happens. Indrajit.
Hi, Matt. Thank you so much for the information and the insights that you've shared with us in the last 1 hour, and especially the distinction between evaluation and coaching. And thanks to Manish for being a very gracious host. So I have a question for you, Matt. under certain circumstances, businesses are forced to take tough decisions of laying off workforce. And sometimes performance feedbacks and evaluations are used as opportunities to sow the seeds in the minds of some employees that they're not needed anymore. In such unfortunate cases, what do you think about the idea of giving them some coaching on the way out, or would that not help in reducing bitterness in the minds of the laid off or about to be laid off employees?
100%. So, Indrajit, I love this strategy. So, whenever I hire people, right, onto my team, I tell them, here is the length of time I expect you to be on my team. And after that length of time, I imagine that I will have helped you grow enough that you will be ready to take something else somewhere else. It may be in the company, it may be outside the company, right? So I'm very explicit about that up front. It is tremendously freeing for people because then when they leave my team, they don't feel like Matt Waller booted me out. They felt like I outgrew this thing, right? Helping people get coaching on the way out of a position. Hey, let me help you find that next thing. Let me help you. Like, this is where I think there's a massive opportunity. One of the CYA things that happens, cover your ass things that happens in a layoff, is they give you placement services. Placement services are typically relatively terrible and very poorly taken advantage of, right? Because they're relatively terrible, right? Job placement is a place that is ripe for disruption. If instead of, well, let me help you redo your resume, they took that as meaningful coaching, meaningful opportunity for growth, meaningful non-evaluation. Evaluation doesn't matter anymore because you're already leaving, right? I don't need evaluation. I just need coaching, right? I think that is a prime opportunity because that's the thing that people want, right? People want growth. Companies want evaluation, right? And so if companies, you're firing this person, you shouldn't care about evaluation anymore. You've done that. You've already decided you're firing them, right? So why not give them the thing they actually want, which is the growth piece that they need in order to take whatever the next step is going to be. And that, to me, increases the chances that you will create boomerangs, right? People who return to your company, right, that leave in such a way that they feel confident and comfortable and excited and, likely to come back. I think that is 100% an open opportunity. And I think at some point, someone will, bring innovation to the sort of post layoff space, and you'll see, if not that, something that looks like that come out.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Manoj.
Could be you, Indrajit. That could be your next company.
Thank you.
And then Upasana, one question if there's time. As the future of work is moving towards remote work and becoming more global and multicultural, how can organizations navigate challenges of cultural differences to ensure fair and culturally sensitive evaluations? So this is why disambiguation is so good, because evaluation is supposed to be objective, right? It's supposed to be real things, but it becomes blended because of the desire to put coaching in there, right? And coaching, has all of these things that, how people coach is very individual. And so I think when you disambiguate those, you can get to more fair and culturally sensitive evaluations because you can come up with things like a behavioral statement, right? Where, all the way back to the beginning of this talk, right? Back to text-driven design. Hey, here's the outcome that needs to be true. Work until the thing turns green, right? Like it's an objective, I know how many stitches are in this cross-stitching, pattern kind of thing. So I think that as you start to disambiguate these, you make it more likely that there will be fewer cultural barriers. Are we going to eliminate cultural barriers entirely? Probably not, right? But are we going to move in a direction? Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a very real possibility that we start to get more sort of sensitive and thoughtful and meaningful by separating those two things. Does that make sense, Upasana? Is that maybe not the answer, but an answer?
Yes, thank you. That makes sense.
I would be excited for it. I mean, this is, you know, to Anil's point, I don't think the problem is promoting pressure, right? Because both people get what they want. The company gets the evaluation that they want. The person gets the coaching that they want. I don't think the problem is promoting pressure. I think it's just hard to do, right? At the moment, we have this we have set up entire organizations around this monolithic idea of a singular manager that does one thing and one thing, or does both of those two things, but is in a single role. And unwinding that is hard. There are significant inhibiting pressures to unwinding that. And so I think a big part of where we struggle is just that's quite hard to do. You could imagine trying an experiment inside of a feedback mechanism where you just disambiguated those two, right? Where you sort of said, let's take the classic sort of evaluative feedback sandwich, right? Where we say, like, what are some strengths? What are some weaknesses? What are some opportunities for growth, right? Which is a blend of evaluation and coaching. What if you just disambiguated? They said, how is this person doing at creating the outcomes they need to create, right? Let's stay on the subjective side. So we're not even going to go to the objective side. We're getting managers and other people to rate you. What if we just said, hey, how is this person doing from a performance perspective, right? And by performance, we mean the accomplishment of the objective things that the business needs them to do, right? And then we said, hey, completely different mode, completely different sort of feeling. What advice would you give them, right? What coaching would you give? What are 3 coaching things that you would give me? I would bet if you even use the words like coaching, you would get a totally different set of things, because people don't feel that now I'm not trying to use what are some weaknesses of Manish simultaneously to coach him on those weaknesses and also evaluate his performance, right? So if I just disambiguated these, I bet you even humans without any additional tooling would produce better outcomes, would be my guess. Manish now over here going like, I wonder if I can run an experiment. Here we go, buddy.
The whole thing, I think, for now is like development rather than like coaching. Organizations consistently use like employee development, and I think that the language also needs to change towards like more coaching and personalized feedback, right? If we were to have technology into it for organizations. Yeah, sorry.
It's interesting, right? Because development is the thing you get with the thing you do is coaching, right?
Outcome is
evaluation is the thing you do, not the thing you get, right? Evaluation is the verb. I guess it's also simultaneously verb and noun, which is sort of interesting in a way that feedback is not. Well, I guess feedback is sort of used as verb and noun. It's interesting. There is coaching the action. I am coaching you. And then there is, I got coaching the noun. It's quite interesting, actually. I wonder if there are ways that you could play with that language to make clearer the verb and noun forms of the thing that you are getting and doing.
Yeah, because we consistently say in behavioral science that behavior define the outcome, right? Then like work towards that. So I think when organizations are using like development, and also now it's like stigmatized. That's for another problem, right? It seems like now just a thing that.
Well, yeah, if you're on a development plan, you better run, right? Like start polishing off your resume if you're on a development plan.
And I know that we've crossed the time, so if you have to, yeah, okay, fair. But yeah, no, thank you so much again, Matt. It's always amazing to speak to you, get all the insights. Yeah, thank you so much for this.
Of course, it's always super fun. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Anil and Indrajit and Pazana and Kajita for hanging out with me on what is a Friday morning for you. And to all of those who are watching the recording later, you missed the opportunity to ask me questions. So now you have to come to the next time that Manish invites me. Then you can ask all the questions you want.
100%.
All right, man.
Thanks, Matt. See you. Have
Peace
a
out.
good night. Bye.
Thank you, man.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Manish. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sanjeev. Bye.